The air in the courtroom was heavy, not just with the silence that hung there like a fog, but with something denser: anticipation, disbelief, maybe even a faint sense of dread. Every seat was taken, and those who stood against the walls leaned forward, trying to catch every word, every gesture, every breath. Mark Lawson sat at the victim's table, hands folded loosely in front of him. His face bore the faded but unmistakable scars from the night that had changed his life forever. Small ridges across his jawline, the slight unevenness of his left cheekbone where the bone had healed imperfectly. There was a quiet dignity in the way he sat, but also a visible limp in his spirit, as though the weight of the months leading up to this moment had pressed something permanently out of him. Across the room, Jordan Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his seat at the defense table. At just 19, he looked both too young and too old at the same time. His face still carried traces of the boyish features Mark remembered from years ago, but prison orange had a way of pulling youth out of a person. His eyes flickered between the floor and Mark, but he never let them linger too long. The judge cleared her throat. "Mr. Lawson, you have the right to address the court before sentencing. Would you like to make a victim impact statement?" All eyes turned toward Mark. He rose slowly, leaning slightly on the polished wood table for support. The sound of his shoes against the floor was soft but seemed amplified in the silence. When he reached the center of the courtroom, he turned not to the judge, not to the audience, but directly to Jordan. The room seemed to contract. Mark inhaled, held it for a moment, then began. "Jordan." His voice was even, but it carried an undercurrent of something raw, something heavy. "I've replayed that night in my head more times than I can count. The rain, the parking lot, the shadow I didn't recognize until it was too late. The pain, physical and otherwise. It's something I wouldn't wish on anyone. And for a long time, I wanted you to feel that same pain." Jordan's eyes lifted for a fraction of a second before darting away again. Mark took a step closer. "But the truth is, I can't carry that anymore. I can't keep holding on to the anger, the bitterness. Because the longer I hold it, the more it poisons me. And I refuse to let that be the rest of my life." A murmur ran through the gallery. The prosecutor's pen froze above her notepad. "I forgive you," Mark said, his voice steady, almost startling in its clarity. "Not because what you did was right. It wasn't. Not because you've earned it, because you haven't, not yet. I forgive you because you are more than the worst thing you've ever done. And because I believe you can still be the young man I once saw potential in." The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. Even she hadn't expected this. Mark turned to her. "Your Honor, I'm asking you, please don't throw this young man's life away. He needs accountability, yes. But more than that, he needs a chance to rebuild, to become better than the choice he made that night." The room erupted in whispers, disbelief, even scoffs. One woman in the back shook her head sharply, muttering something about foolishness. Mark's sister, seated behind him, looked as though she'd been physically struck by his words. The judge tapped her gavel once, calling the room back to order. But the tension remained electric, impossible to dissipate. Mark stepped back toward his seat, but his eyes never left Jordan's. For the first time in months, Jordan met his gaze fully. And in those seconds, there was something unspoken. Something that looked almost like shame, almost like gratitude, tangled together in a way that was hard to name. As Mark sat down, the judge took a deep breath and began her sentencing remarks. But for most people in that courtroom, the decision had already been made, not by the law, but by the man who had every reason to demand retribution and chose something else instead. And yet, no one there, not the judge, not the lawyers, not even Mark himself, could have guessed how far the ripples of that single act of mercy would travel, or how they would come back to him in a way that would one day leave the entire town speechless. If you'd asked anyone in Fairview what they thought of Mark Lawson before the night, you'd hear the same things over and over. A good man. A heart too big for his own good. The kind of teacher you don't forget. Mark had been teaching art at Fairview High for 17 years. It wasn't a prestigious job, and the paychecks weren't anything to brag about. But for Mark, the satisfaction came from watching students discover that they were capable of creating something beautiful with their own hands. In his classroom, the clumsy sketches of first-timers were celebrated with as much enthusiasm as the stunning portraits of the naturally gifted. Art's not just about talent, he often told his students. It's about courage. Every line you draw is you saying, "This is how I see the world." And that's something no one can take from you. He lived in a modest two-story house on Birchwood Lane. His neighbors, the Parkers, often saw him mowing the lawn in faded jeans and paint-splattered shirts. He kept a small vegetable garden in the backyard, tomatoes, peppers, and herbs, and gave away most of his harvest to elderly neighbors who couldn't keep gardens of their own. On Sundays, he'd volunteer at the community center, running free art workshops for kids who couldn't afford materials. Mark had never married. There had been a few relationships over the years, but his devotion to teaching and community work often came first, and eventually the romantic chapters of his life faded into the background. Instead, his students became his extended family. He knew their birthdays, their favorite colors, and their home situations. When he noticed bruises or signs of trouble, he didn't just look the other way, he intervened. Sometimes that meant staying late to talk. Sometimes it meant quietly making sure a kid had lunch money or supplies. That's how he met Jordan Hayes. Jordan was 14 the first time he walked into Mark's classroom. Skinny to the point of looking underfed, hair perpetually messy, clothes faded and often a size too small. His eyes carried the wary sharpness of someone who had learned not to trust easily. Mark quickly learned that Jordan's home life was a mess. His father had walked out when he was 7, and his mother's battle with addiction was no secret. Jordan had been in and out of foster care, often staying with relatives who saw him more as a burden than a child. By the time he reached high school, he'd already built a wall between himself and the rest of the world. Mark had seen kids like him before. Kids who acted tough to cover the hurt. Kids who dared you to care because they'd already decided you wouldn't. He made it his mission to prove Jordan wrong. Started small. Mark gave him a set of decent sketch pencils after noticing him doodling in the margins of his notebook. Then he stayed after class to help him with a project, not because Jordan needed it, he didn't, but because it gave them a chance to talk. When Jordan got into trouble for fighting in the hallway, Mark was the one who convinced the principal not to suspend him, arguing that it would only push him further away. Slowly, Jordan began to trust him. He started showing up to the art club after school, sometimes staying hours just to work in silence while Mark graded papers or prepped materials. Mark saw flashes of something remarkable in him, not just artistic skill, but a mind that saw patterns and meaning where others didn't. There was one afternoon in particular Mark never forgot. They were working on a mural for the school's main hallway, a swirling mix of blues and golds, abstract but full of motion. Jordan, usually reserved, was animated, explaining how the shapes represented chaos trying to become something good. Mark had looked at him then and thought, this kid has a chance. If someone just keeps believing in him, he can make it. Over the next few years, Jordan graduated from being one of Mark's most troubled students to one of his most promising. He even won a regional art competition, his piece, a gritty but hopeful depiction of an urban street corner, earning praise from local newspapers. Mark was proud enough to hang a copy of it in his classroom. But as high school drew to a close, Jordan's life began to unravel again. His mother overdosed. He moved in with an uncle who was known more for his criminal record than his parenting skills. Jordan started skipping school. By the time he was 18, he had dropped out entirely. Mark tried to reach him. He called. He visited his uncle's house. He even offered to help Jordan enroll in a community college art program. But the calls went unanswered, and the door stayed shut. Still, Mark held on to hope. He'd seen kids go through worse and come out the other side. And in his heart, he believed Jordan would find his way back. Maybe not today, maybe not this year, but someday. Life in Fairview continued much as it always had for Mark. He kept teaching, kept volunteering, kept quietly doing the kind of work that never made headlines but shaped lives in ways that couldn't be measured. If there was any flaw in him, it was that he believed too strongly in people's capacity to change. And then, one rainy night, that belief would be tested in a way that would leave scars far deeper than the ones on his skin. It was the kind of rain that blurred the edges of everything, turning the town into a watercolor painting. Streetlights glowed hazy gold through the downpour, and the sound of water slapping against pavement created a low, steady drumbeat. Mark Lawson locked the double doors of Fairview High's gymnasium with a practiced twist of the wrist. Behind him, the echo of the charity auction still clung to the air. The laughter, the clink of glasses, the soft notes from the jazz trio that had performed near the bleachers. It had been a good night. The art department would have enough funds for new supplies, and several students had sold their work, beaming as strangers praised their creativity. Mark carried 2 bags, one with leftover auction items, the other with folders of paperwork he'd promised himself he'd grade at home. His breath formed faint clouds in the cool night air. The parking lot was nearly empty now, the wet asphalt shining like a black mirror. His old silver Corolla waited in the far corner, under a flickering light. He didn't think much about the placement. It was where he usually parked when the lot was crowded. But tonight, the distance seemed longer than usual. Halfway there, he heard it. A soft, quick shuffle. He paused, adjusting the bags on his shoulder, and glanced around. Nothing. Just the hum of rain on metal rooftops and the occasional hiss of tires from a passing car on Main Street. He took a few more steps. Another sound, this one sharper. Footsteps. Close. "Hello?" he called, his voice carrying strangely in the wet air. No answer. A cold trickle of unease slid down his spine. He told himself it was nothing. Maybe just the wind pushing trash across the pavement, or a stray cat sheltering under the cars. Still, his grip on the bags tightened. He reached his Corolla and fumbled for the keys. That's when a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness beside the maintenance shed. Before he could react, the figure lunged. Through the blur, he caught fragments of the attacker's face, young, too young. A jawline he recognized but couldn't place in that moment of panic. Eyes that wouldn't meet his. "Why?" Mark rasped, but his voice was swallowed by the rain. The pressure lifted suddenly, and then the footsteps retreated fast, fading into the night. Mark lay there, the cold soaking into him, the rain mixing with the warmth of his blood. His vision tunneled. He thought of his classroom, the mural in the hallway, the faces of his students. He thought, absurdly, about the tomatoes in his garden, and whether they'd ripen before the season ended. A distant voice pierced the haze. "Hey! Over here!" The sound of running feet. A woman's face above him, wide-eyed and frantic. "Stay with me. Okay? Just stay with me." Sirens wailed somewhere far off, growing closer. Blue and red lights began to dance across the slick pavement. Mark's consciousness flickered, the edges of the world going soft. Before the darkness closed in, he caught one last image in his mind. Not the face of his attacker, but the mural Jordan Hayes had painted years ago. Chaos is trying to become something good. And then everything went black. When Mark woke, the world was white and slow-moving. The first thing he noticed was the smell, sharp antiseptic mixed with something faintly metallic. Then came the beeping, steady and methodical, like a mechanical heartbeat. His body felt heavy, pinned down not by weight but by exhaustion. He tried to move and was met with a dull, pulling pain in his side. Hey, don't," a soft voice said. He turned his head slightly and saw his sister, Clara, leaning forward in the chair beside his bed. Her eyes were puffy, her hair pulled into a messy bun that said she hadn't left the hospital in a while. "You're awake," she breathed, as if afraid speaking too loud might undo the moment. Mark swallowed, his throat dry as sand. What happened? His voice was raspy, each word dragging across his vocal cords like stones. Clara hesitated. "You were attacked. Outside the school. You lost a lot of blood. They had to operate to stop the bleeding. Punctured lung." Fragments of the night returned in jagged flashes. Rain, footsteps, the metallic glint, the pain. And that face, those eyes. "They caught him?" Mark asked. Clara's expression tightened. "Yes, caught him less than 2 hours after it happened. He didn't get far. Some shop owner saw someone matching the description running through the alley behind Main and called it in." Mark waited, sensing something in her voice. She didn't meet his gaze when she said it. "It's Jordan, Mark. Jordan Hayes. The words landed like a punch to the chest, harder than the knife had been. For a moment he thought he'd misheard. "No," he said, shaking his head slightly. "No, Jordan wouldn't." Clara's eyes brimmed. "I'm sorry. It's him. They found your wallet in his pocket. The knife too," he confessed. Mark sank back into the pillows, staring up at the ceiling. His mind reeled, images of Jordan as a boy flashing before him. The skinny kid with the guarded eyes, the way he'd grinned when his painting won the competition, the afternoons they'd spent talking over sketches. It didn't fit. None of it fit. "Why?" he whispered, more to himself than to her. "They think it was a robbery," Clara said. "He's been in trouble lately, petty theft, drugs. Maybe he thought you'd have cash from the auction. I don't know, Mark. People change." But that was the problem. Mark had built his whole life on believing people could change for the better. To hear the same phrase twisted into something bitter made his stomach turn. Later that afternoon, Detective Ron Keller came to take his statement. Keller was a stocky man with kind eyes that had seen too much. He stood at the foot of the bed, notebook in hand. "You up for this?" he asked. "I need to be," Mark replied. They went over the details. Mark described the rain, the footsteps, the first blow, the knife. He admitted he hadn't recognized the face right away. Not until Clara had told him. Keller nodded, jotting it all down. "He's not saying much," the detective added. "Claims he was high, doesn't remember all of it. But with the evidence we've got, it's solid. This will go to trial." When Keller left, the hospital room felt larger, emptier. The hum of the machines filled the silence. Mark closed his eyes and tried to reconcile the Jordan he knew with the one who had left him bleeding in the rain. He remembered the mural, chaos becoming something good, and wondered if Jordan had ever believed that himself, or if it had just been words he painted because they sounded nice. Over the next week, Mark's body began the slow process of healing. The stabbing pain in his side dulled to an ache. The bruises faded from deep purple to sickly yellow. But his mind was a tangle. He dreamed about Jordan almost every night, sometimes as the teenager in his art class, sometimes as the shadow with the knife. Sometimes, in the dream, they were the same person. Clara tried to keep him focused on the practical: appointments, medications, rest. But the trial loomed like a dark shape on the horizon. One afternoon, as she refilled his water glass, Clara said, "You know you'll have to testify. They'll want to know everything. And you should tell them what he's done. Make sure he gets what's coming to him." Mark didn't answer right away. He stared out the window at the bare winter branches swaying against the pale sky. Finally, he said, "And if what's coming to him isn't the end of his life, but the chance to start over?" Clara froze, glass halfway to the nightstand. "Mark, don't do this. Don't start making excuses for him." "I'm not," he said quietly. "I'm just trying to remember who he was before the night everything went wrong." Clara's eyes softened with pity, but her voice stayed firm. "That person doesn't exist anymore." Mark didn't argue, but deep down he wasn't sure he believed her. Or maybe he just didn't want to, because if Jordan was beyond saving, then maybe all the years Mark had spent believing in second chances had been a lie. And that was a truth he wasn't ready to face. Mark's discharge from the hospital didn't feel like freedom. It felt like being released into a world that no longer made sense. His house, usually a quiet refuge, felt too big now. Every creak in the floorboards made his shoulders tighten. He kept glancing over his shoulder when he walked from room to room, even though the doors were locked and the windows latched. Physically, he was healing slowly. The knife wound was stitched, the bruises fading. But there were moments, usually at night, when his body betrayed him. He'd lie in bed and suddenly feel again the boot pressing into his back, the rain soaking through his clothes, the sound of footsteps retreating. He'd jolt awake, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding like he'd been running. And then there was Jordan. The man who had once sat in the back of his classroom sketching patterns on notebook paper now sat in a county jail cell, awaiting trial. Mark hadn't seen him since the night of the attack, but Jordan's face followed him everywhere. Not the hardened mugshot from the local paper. Mark avoided looking at that, but the flashes of memory. the half-smile when a project turned out well, the way his eyes lit up talking about a new idea for the mural. The prosecutor, Elaine Cooper, came to visit him one afternoon. A sharp, efficient woman with a no-nonsense manner, she laid out the state's case at his kitchen table. "This is strong," she said, flipping through her notes. "We've got the weapon, your wallet, his prints, witness statements, and his own confession. With your testimony, we can make sure he gets the maximum sentence." "How long?" Mark asked. "With his prior offenses? Easily 20 years. Maybe more." Mark's stomach twisted. He'd be nearly 40 when he got out. "That's the point," Elaine said. "You take dangerous people off the streets so they can't hurt anyone else." He didn't answer. Instead, his gaze drifted to the framed photo on the wall, last year's art club group picture. Jordan was there, back row, hands shoved in his hoodie pocket, smirking just enough to break through his usual guarded expression. Elaine followed his gaze. "I know you knew him, Mark, and I know this makes it harder, but you can't let that cloud your judgment. He tried to kill you." After she left, Mark sat at the table long after the sound of her car faded. Her words rang in his head, mixing with his own memories until they formed a storm he couldn't quiet. That night, Clara called. "I talked to Elaine," she said. "She said you're hesitating." "I'm thinking," he replied. "Thinking about what? Whether to let him get away with it." "Clara, it's not that simple." "It is," she said firmly. "He made his choice when he came after you. This isn't your responsibility anymore. Let the law handle it." But Mark knew the law could handle only part of it. The rest, the part where someone had to look at Jordan and see more than his crime, that was something the law didn't do. He started walking in the evenings, partly for his recovery, partly to clear his head. The cold March air bit at his lungs, but he liked the sting. It made him feel awake. On these walks, he'd pass the community center, now shuttered for the night. Through the glass doors, he'd see the art room, the tables still littered with paper scraps, paintbrushes in water cups. One evening, he found himself stopping there, standing in the glow of the street lamp. He remembered the first time Jordan had shown up for a free Saturday workshop, standing off to the side, pretending he wasn't interested. By the end of the day, he'd painted a jagged skyline in shades of orange and black, messy but vibrant, like he was trying to put his whole self into it. Mark thought about that painting now. Was that version of Jordan gone forever? Or was he still in there somewhere under all the mistakes and anger? The week before the trial, the prison chaplain reached out. "Jordan's asked to see you," he said. Mark didn't answer right away. Every instinct told him to say no. But something else, a quieter, stubborn part of him, was curious. When he arrived at the county jail, he was led to a small visiting room. Jordan was already there, sitting behind the glass. He looked smaller than Mark remembered, his orange jumpsuit loose on his frame. His eyes flicked up when Mark entered, then quickly down again. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Jordan cleared his throat. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. I don't even know why I did it. I was high. I was broke. I thought maybe..." He stopped, shaking his head. "Doesn't matter. I messed up. Bad." Mark studied him, searching for something, remorse maybe, or recognition. "Do you remember the mural?" he asked. Jordan's brow furrowed. "At the school. Chaos trying to become something good. You said that once." Jordan gave a short, humorless laugh. "Guess I didn't exactly live up to it." "Not yet," Mark said softly. The guard signaled their time was up. As Mark stood to leave, Jordan said, "Whatever you tell them in court, I'll understand." Mark walked out into the cool air, his thoughts heavier than when he'd arrived. That night, lying awake, he realized he'd already made his decision. He wasn't going to ask for the maximum sentence. And in the days that followed, he prepared for the moment he would stand in that courtroom. Not to condemn, but to try, one last time, to believe in redemption. The courthouse smelled faintly of polish and old paper, a scent that seemed to settle in Mark's chest like a weight. The trial had drawn a small crowd. Curious locals filled the wooden benches, whispering as the attorneys shuffled their papers, and the bailiff called for order. In the front row, Clara sat stiffly, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles blanched. She gave Mark a firm nod as he passed, but her eyes carried a silent plea. Don't do anything reckless. Jordan was led in through the side door. His wrists were cuffed, his head bowed. He didn't scan the room, didn't look for anyone, until his eyes found Mark. For a split second, their gazes locked. It was nothing dramatic, no swelling music, just a quiet acknowledgement. I see you. You're still here. The prosecutor, Elaine, laid out the case with precision. Photographs of the wound, the recovered weapon, the testimony of the officers who arrested Jordan hours after the attack. Her words were crisp and factual, each one designed to leave no doubt in the jury's mind. When it was his turn to take the stand, Mark felt every step to the witness chair as though he were walking a tightrope. The clerk swore him in, and he took a seat, hands resting on his lap. Elaine began gently. Mr. Callahan, could you tell the court what happened on the night of March 14th? Mark recounted the evening. Locking up the community center, the sound of footsteps, the sudden blow. He described the struggle, the cold, the pain, and then the darkness before he woke up in the hospital. He spoke clearly, without embellishment, but each word felt like reopening a wound. And do you see the person who attacked you here in the courtroom today? Mark hesitated. Yes. He nodded toward Jordan. It was him. Elaine gave a satisfied nod, then continued. Given the severity of the attack and your injuries, do you believe the defendant should be punished to the full extent of the law? The question hung in the air. The room stilled. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the slam of the gavel, the moral conclusion. Mark took a slow breath. I believe, he said carefully, that what Jordan did was wrong. There's no question, and I believe there should be consequences. But, a murmur rippled through the audience. Mark glanced at Jordan, then back at the jury. I also believe people can change. I've known Jordan for years. I've seen him create things, beautiful things, when he had the chance and the guidance. I don't think throwing him away for 20 years will make the world safer. I think it will just make him harder. Elaine's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't interrupt. I'm not asking you to let him walk free, Mark continued. I'm asking you to give him a sentence that includes rehabilitation, not just punishment. Time to reflect, to get clean, to work. I'm willing to help with that when he's out. I forgive him, not because what he did was okay, but because holding on to anger will only destroy both of us. Silence followed. Even the judge seemed momentarily taken aback. The defense attorney, a weary man who'd clearly prepared for a very different testimony, rose slowly. No further questions, he said, almost dazed. When Mark stepped down from the stand, Clara caught his arm. You forgive him? She whispered fiercely. After what he did? Yes, Mark said simply, because I have to live with myself after this. And I can't live with bitterness. The trial concluded that afternoon. The jury deliberated for hours before returning with their verdict. Guilty of aggravated assault with a recommended sentence of 8 years, eligible for early release with completion of a rehabilitation program. It wasn't what Elaine had pushed for. It wasn't what the more vengeful part of the crowd wanted. But it was something different, a kind of middle path. As the bailiff moved to escort Jordan out, the young man turned his head toward Mark. No words passed between them, but his lips moved just enough for Mark to read the silent thank you. It was enough. Mark walked out of the courthouse into the cool spring air, feeling a strange mixture of exhaustion and relief. Forgiveness hadn't erased the scar on his side or the fear that sometimes gripped him at night, but it had loosened something in his chest, freed him from the endless loop of replaying that moment in the alley. And somewhere deep down, he hoped it might free Jordan, too. For weeks after the trial, life for Mark settled into something resembling normal. He returned to work at the community center, though Clara noticed he locked the doors a little earlier and walked with a new cautiousness in unfamiliar streets. His decision to forgive Jordan had rippled through the town in unpredictable ways. Some people approached him with admiration. Strangers stopped him in the grocery store to say they'd read about his testimony in the local paper and that his words had moved them. A retired teacher pressed his hand one afternoon and whispered, "You gave that boy a chance most people wouldn't." But there were others. One evening, as he left the center, a man leaning against a lamppost called out, "Hey, preacher boy!" When Mark turned, the man sneered. "How's it feel knowing you let a thug off easy? You think he won't do it again? When he hurts someone else, that's on you." Mark didn't respond. He'd already rehearsed in his head 100 times what he could say, that forgiveness wasn't about excusing harm, that it was about refusing to be defined by it. But the man's eyes were sharp and unyielding. Some people weren't ready to understand. Still, Mark kept his quiet resolve. Then the letter arrived. Came in a plain envelope, no return address. The handwriting was uneven, as if written in a hurry. "Mark, I don't deserve what you did for me. You should have let them bury me in there. But you didn't. I don't know why, but I'm gonna try to be worth it. They've got me in a program here, anger management, group therapy, even a carpentry workshop. I'm not good at talking, but I'm good at building things. I made a small box for my sister's birthday out of scrap wood. First thing I've made in years that wasn't for money or out of desperation. I don't expect you to write back. Just, thank you. You might have saved my life. Jordan." Mark read the letter 3 times before setting it down. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was something real. That night, he drafted a short reply. "Jordan, I forgave you because I believe we're more than the worst thing we've done. Keep building things. Mark." Months passed. Mark received more letters, updates about Jordan's progress in the rehab program, the books he was reading, the people he was meeting who challenged his old ways of thinking. In one, Jordan mentioned he'd started tutoring another inmate in math. "Never thought I'd be the one teaching someone," he wrote. "Feels strange. Feels good." These letters didn't erase the past, but they added layers to it. Jordan was no longer just the man who'd attacked him in a dark alley. He was a person growing, stumbling, and trying again. Then, something happened that no one saw coming. The local news station ran a segment on the prison's rehabilitation program, interviewing several participants. One of them was Jordan. He spoke about the night of the attack. Not in detail, but enough to admit he'd been drunk, high, and desperate, that he'd lashed out without thinking. He said, "Someone I hurt more than anyone else decided to forgive me. That's not something I'll ever forget. I don't know if I can make it right, but I'm trying." Within days, the clip spread online. Comments poured in, some skeptical, others deeply moved. A few local business owners even contacted the program offering jobs to inmates upon release. But the most unexpected consequence came when a man named Edward Langley, a philanthropist known for funding community rehabilitation projects, reached out to Mark directly. "I saw the segment," Langley said over the phone, his voice warm but direct. "What you did, standing up in court like that, it's rare, and it works. I'd like to fund an expansion of your community center. More programs, more outreach, especially for people like Jordan, before they get desperate." Mark was stunned. The expansion would mean after-school programs, job training workshops, and even a small makerspace for carpentry and crafts. It was everything he'd dreamed of but never had the budget for. And it all stemmed from one choice on a tense day in court. Not everyone celebrated. Clara was still worried. "You're opening the doors wider, Mark," she said one evening as they closed up the center. "You're going to get more people like Jordan coming through here, and the next one might not get a redemption arc." "I know," Mark replied, "but the only way to prevent the next one is to reach them before they get desperate. I'd rather risk it than watch another kid fall through the cracks." Clara sighed, but she didn't argue further. The next letter from Jordan came 6 months later. "Mark, I've been approved for early release next year. I want to work, real work. I don't know if you'd want me anywhere near the community center, but if you do, I'd like to help. I'm not the same person I was when I walked into that alley. Jordan." Mark folded the letter and stared out the window. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the street. Somewhere out there, a man who once left him bleeding in the cold was now asking for a chance to help build something. Forgiveness, it seemed, didn't just change people. It built bridges no one believed possible. Mark's first instinct when he read Jordan's request was hesitation. Not because he doubted Jordan's sincerity. By now, the letters felt more like conversations between two men than exchanges between victim and offender, but because he understood the weight of bringing Jordan into his community. One wrong move and people would say, "We told you so." One wrong move and the trust they'd begun building would crumble. Still, after days of pacing his living room and rereading the letter, Mark made a decision. He wrote back, "Jordan, if you're serious about working when you get out, I'll find you a place here. But know this, your past will be no secret. People will know who you are and what you did. What will matter is what you do from the moment you walk through that door." Mark. When Jordan was finally released, Mark met him outside the prison gates. The man who emerged looked nothing like the one who had once attacked him. His hair was shorter, his frame leaner, and his eyes clearer somehow. They shook hands awkwardly at first, both knowing the unspoken history between them. "Ready to work?" Mark asked. Jordan smiled faintly. "More than ready." At the community center, the first few weeks were tense. Parents eyed Jordan with suspicion. A few even threatened to pull their kids from after-school programs. Clara, though outwardly polite, kept a hawk-like watch whenever Jordan was in the building. Jordan didn't complain. He showed up early, stayed late, fixed things without being asked, and slowly earned nods instead of stares. One afternoon, while repairing a broken cabinet, Jordan found a group of teenagers arguing in the hallway. He intervened, not with threats or shouting, but with a calm, firm voice. He told them about a fight he once got into that spiraled into something worse. How one bad choice had led to years behind bars. "Don't be me," he said simply. The kids listened. Months passed, and something remarkable happened. The skepticism began to fade. Jordan became known as the guy who could fix anything, the one who never took a lunch break until the work was done. Some even forgot or pretended to forget why they'd been wary of him. But one night, as Mark was locking up, he noticed Jordan lingering in the workshop. "You heading home?" Mark asked. Jordan didn't look up. "There's something I need to tell you." The story that spilled out was not what Mark expected. Jordan admitted that the night of the attack hadn't been random. He'd been following Mark for a reason. Not to rob him, not exactly, but because someone had paid him to. Mark's breath caught. "Paid you? By who?" Jordan hesitated, then said a name Mark hadn't heard in years. Vincent Hale. Vincent had once been Mark's business partner in a small contracting firm. Years ago, when Mark discovered Vincent was skimming funds, he'd reported him to the authorities. Vincent had lost everything, his license, his reputation, his company. Mark hadn't thought about him in over a decade. "He told me you'd ruined his life," Jordan said quietly. "Said you were a liar and a cheat. Offered me a chunk of cash to scare you. I was high, broke, and angry at the world. I didn't ask questions. I didn't care." Mark's hands tightened around the edge of a table. This changed everything. The attack that had reshaped his life hadn't been a chance act of violence. It had been revenge, ordered by a man he thought was gone from his world. Jordan swallowed. "I didn't know he meant for me to. I thought it was just to rough you up. But once I started, his voice cracked. I lost control." For a long moment, Mark said nothing. Here stood the man he had forgiven, the man he'd brought into his second home, now revealing that his pain had roots deeper and more personal than he'd imagined. "You could have kept this to yourself," Mark finally said. "I almost did," Jordan admitted. "But every day I work here, I think about how I don't deserve it, and I can't move forward unless you know the whole truth." Mark spent that night unable to sleep. He thought of Vincent Hale, somewhere out there, still carrying the bitterness that had destroyed them both in different ways. He thought of Jordan, who had been a weapon in someone else's grudge. And he thought of forgiveness, wondering if it had limits. By morning, he had made another decision. A week later, Mark and Jordan stood outside a worn-down office building on the edge of town. Vincent Hale's name was still faintly visible on the weathered signage, though the business inside now belonged to someone else. When Vincent finally appeared in the doorway, his face registered shock, then a slow, curling smile. Well, Vincent drawled. Look who decided to visit. I see you brought your little attack dog. Mark stepped forward. I know everything, Vincent. About the money. About that night. Vincent shrugged. Statute of limitations, Mark. You can't touch me. Mark didn't flinch. I'm not here to touch you. I'm here to tell you that I forgive you. The words hit the air like a stone dropped into still water. Vincent's smile faltered. You what? You wanted me broken, Mark continued. You nearly got your wish, but I'm not carrying that weight anymore. You can keep your grudges. I won't keep mine. Maybe, Mark said, turning to leave, but I'm free, and that's something you'll never be until you let go. Back at the community center, Jordan asked quietly, Why'd you let him walk? Mark looked at him and said, Because I learned something from forgiving you. Sometimes the real punishment is letting someone live with themselves. And in the quiet that followed, Mark realized the truth. His forgiveness hadn't just changed Jordan's life. It had ended a chain of revenge years in the making. The seasons shifted as they always do. Summer's green gave way to autumn's fire, then to the soft gray of winter. By the time the first blossoms of spring returned, Mark realized something remarkable. Life had regained a rhythm that felt whole again. It wasn't the same as before the attack. Some scars never vanish entirely, but it was no longer defined by that night. The community center had transformed too. Under Jordan's steady hands, the building had gone from a slightly neglected hub to a place that felt vibrant and cared for. Walls once scuffed and faded were now bright with fresh paint. The gardens out front bloomed because Jordan had taken it upon himself to learn landscaping. Kids who once eyed him warily now waved when they saw him, sometimes racing to meet him at the door. Clara, who had been the most suspicious, finally confessed over coffee one afternoon. I was wrong about him. Mark just smiled. Most of us are wrong about someone at some point, but the biggest change happened inside Jordan. He no longer carried himself like a man waiting for the next shoe to drop. His voice had gained an easy steadiness. His laughter, rare in the beginning, had become common. He'd even started taking night classes, studying carpentry formally, with the dream of one day running his own small business. One evening, as Mark locked up, Jordan walked over, wiping paint from his hands. Hey, Jordan said, do you ever think about that night? Mark looked at him for a long moment. Not like I used to. I think about it, Jordan admitted. But not with guilt anymore. More like, it's a mile marker. A point on the road I had to pass to get here. That's a good way to see it, Mark said. Do you ever wish you hadn't forgiven me? Jordan asked suddenly. Mark's answer came without hesitation. Not for a second. The truth was, forgiveness had not erased the past. It had reframed it. It had taken something meant to destroy and turned it into the foundation for something stronger. It had rippled outward, softening the community's suspicion, dismantling old fears, even confronting the ghost of Vincent Hale's malice without returning the poison. Forgiveness had been a risk, but it had paid in dividends no court verdict or prison sentence could have matched. The twist of fate came in the form of an unexpected letter. It was from Vincent. The handwriting was shaky, the paper yellowed. Inside, there were only a few lines. Mark, you were right. I haven't known peace in years. I don't know if I ever will. But for what it's worth, I'm sorry. Mark read it twice, then folded it and placed it in the drawer of his desk. Not as a keepsake. He didn't need reminders, but as proof that even the hardest stones can crack when the water of grace runs long enough. The celebration happened almost a year to the day after Jordan's release. The community center hosted a fundraiser, and the place was packed. Parents, kids, local business owners, all mingling in the rooms Jordan had fixed with his own two hands. During the speeches, Clara stood up. There's someone here who's taught us all a lot about second chances, she said. Someone who's shown that redemption isn't just a word. It's a choice you make every day. Jordan, this place wouldn't be what it is without you. Applause filled the room. Jordan stood awkwardly at first, then stepped forward. I didn't think I'd ever belong anywhere again, he said, voice trembling. But someone believed I could. And because of that, I learned to believe it too. So, thank you. All of you. And especially you, Mark. Mark simply nodded. Words would have been too small for the moment. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the center was quiet, Mark and Jordan stood together in the doorway. Feels like a long time since that night, Jordan said softly. Mark looked out into the dark street. It was a long time ago, and also yesterday. Funny how memories work. Jordan smiled faintly. Guess the only way to make the bad ones fade is to make better ones. Mark patted his shoulder. Exactly. The final lesson settled in Mark's heart like the last note of a song. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It isn't pretending the harm never happened. It's deciding that the harm will not have the last word. And sometimes that decision doesn't just set you free, it sets the other person free too. When Mark locked the door for the night, he knew the chapter was closed. Not because the story had ended, but because it had turned into something entirely new. And for the first time in years, he walked home under the streetlights without feeling the shadow of that night following him. He wasn't looking over his shoulder anymore, because there was nothing behind him worth fearing.